be either.
Now I'm going to admit it. Today's going to be profane because I'm really pissed. But I have to look at what it is that's pissing me off and how it relates to this metaphysics, to this psychology and mythology of our time. And over, I see that we are on the brink of something. We are on the brink of something. So I want to tell you a little bit about my journey. First of all, I want a list. I want everyone to know that I still believe America is the planet's last best hope. We've talked about this, reflecting diversity, growing into new understandings and expanding. But something's happened to that movement. Something's confused us. How do we talk about what is before us? We can't have a proper prognosis until we have a diagnosis. So how do we talk about what is wrong and do it in a way that reaches into the spiritual, reaches into the personal, reaches into the planetary? Now, I'll be honest, I was pretty much a Democrat most of my early life. And in 1976, I decided, I ought to do something. So I started going down to the Democratic Party, and mostly on Tuesday nights, I would be stuffing envelopes. And I did that for a few months. And finally, someone said, hey, a representative, Herb Harris, needs a driver the next few weekends. Would you be willing to drive him? And I went, oh, yeah. I thought maybe I was going to drive a limo, right? No way. And basically, it was driving this guy to, Little League games to throw out the first pitch of the season. It was pretty cool. I think this was 1977 at this point. So I started driving this guy. And you know what? I went, what the fuck? This guy couldn't hold a conversation. It was just the most amazing thing I ever saw. And then I was a loyal Rolling Stone reader at the time, and there was this writer, William Greider, and he had just written a book called Who Will Tell the People? And I read that book, and I went, what the fuck? So here I am, and I said, I can't be a Democrat anymore. So I became an independent. I left that place, and I came up with a conclusion that still holds true. The Republicans are insidious, and the Democrats are inept. Now, they held, a coalition for, 30 years before they started breaking up and the problems entered. And, 1977, William Greider, Who Will Tell the People, still happening, still true. So how do we talk about today's problems? And I'm going to use the language of Carl Jung and talk about the shadow. Now, the shadow is all those things that we don't want to own and we put into the unconscious part of who we are. We just don't want to own them. And it's important to know that the shadow also holds those good parts of us that are unowned. The guy who wants to be a carpenter, but a mother makes him become a doctor. Well, carpentry is in his shadow. It's a good thing. It's part of who he is. However, what we're talking about today is those aspects of the shadow that we really don't want to own. And there's a lot of them, and they're unconscious. And part of the journey is making these aspects that are unconscious conscious. What did Rod Serling say? We're working on building a new citizenry, one that is selective about cereals and automobiles, but won't be able to think. You see, there's this whole piece of getting us to dumb down. And it really has to do with not owning our shadow. I mean, let's just look at a brief list of some of our shadow stuff. We came here as a people, as God's moral exemplars, and yet we decimated 40 tribes right off. We broke over 400 treaties. Our Civil War was to settle a debate about slavery after we wrote it into our Constitution. We claimed we had manifest destiny called by God to liberate the people of Philippines from Spain. In the process, we killed over 500,000 Filipinos. And the beat goes on. The war. Think about this, my friends. In our history, we've only had 17 years without war. Think about that. We are good at war, let me tell you. And the last refuge, of course, is war against ourselves. And that's part of what's going on. There's this thing that's happening, okay? Now, I believe that every generation has its own iteration when the dark comes in to play with the light. That's from a song I wrote called Patriot Song. And it opens like this. What's going on when we get it wrong? Peering over the ledge is when we're most on our growing edge. If we were sitting in Carl Jung's office right now, he'd say, we're not having a session. We're going to break out some champagne because something really good is percolating. However, all this shadow stuff that we're trying to own now, and that's pretty much what's going on. There is this huge backlash, basically a whole movement to keep us in denial of our shadow work, of what is in that dark bag that is not morally exemplar, if you will. Over and over we see how divided we are. And this is what I want us to see today a little bit. We are divided now like we've only been divided a few different times in our history. The Civil War is the most obvious one, but also we're divided. Our parties are now divided, according to Cornell Clayton. The parties are divided like they haven't been for 100 years, since probably the late 19th century, the beginning of the 20th century. The parties are now not about ideas, but about identity. The Republican Party is basically divided from the Democratic Party by race, education, level of education, religion, and geography. The Republican is becoming the rural party, and the Democratic Party is becoming the urban party. We could go through all the different divides, but what is important to understand is that the parties have become competitive. They're not looking really to work together anymore. And this is an important part. Another piece is the system. The constitutional system is really biased towards the Republican Party. The system is keeping a minority party in power where it really should not be. Democracy works when voters are able to shift power if one party becomes extreme. But the Republican Party has now learned, using the Constitution, to rule with a minority. They benefit from the constitutional advantages, and it keeps them in power, but the political system is not, although designed more for the Republicans, is there to empower the people. And that's part of what's obstructing us. But part of what's obstructing us is we have got to own some shit, my friends, and that is hard to do because it's me, it's us. I've talked about reading this book on Robert E. Lee, which is laborious to me, although it's getting better, because of all the lies I've been told about Robert E. Lee, and I wanted to know the truth. Yeah, he was a noble person, but he was a traitor. He even said secessionism is for traitors, insurgents, and anarchists. And he fought against secessionism, but he lost, and then he ended up killing hundreds of thousands of Americans in the name of what he didn't believe in. Over and over, we see this piece of America. Now, I watched George Carlin. He said rights. We just made that up. Yes, we did. We made up justice. We made up a lot of things. And the Native Americans would call these shields. These are systems of shields and protocol that protect us as a people, that ensure us a way of life. That's what the Constitution is. That's what Robert's rules are. That's what the rules based system around the world that we've tried to implement, not very well, because there's a lot of shadow stuff in that we can talk about. So today, I want us to start understanding, and there is a huge movement, education movement, and there are huge movements against that, against teaching racism, against saying the word gay in school. All these things are attempts to keep us from addressing our shadow stuff. And again, it can sound like an indictment, because I am very pissed, and there's a part of me that's indicting like hell, and it's indicting myself as well. But it's, how do we diagnose this problem? How do we find a language to talk about it so that we can start evoking some healing aspects to it? And there's lots of symptoms to it. Truth is the first, being the truth challenge is a symptom of the shadowed unowned. So I just laid out a whole bunch. I'm really angry. As I said, there's going to be profane. I'm going to push the explicit button. Bob's coming to us from Florida. Mary Ann's coming to us from Spokane Valley, Washington. I'm up on the South Hill in Spokane. Mary Ann, I just laid out a whole lot, and I want, for my spiritual heart, I keep looking for a way to bring some light to the dark, but the light that most people bring, many people don't want to see or hear.
Well, I think that just because you don't want to see or hear something, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. So I think that there are some very dark things, but I think there is light. And I think that we are in a time right now. One of the things that you talked about was the history and how we've been in situations like this before. But I think that even before, humanity, we just keep repeating the same cycles. And I always kind of bring things back to the personal. So how does that relate within each one of us? And if you look at the work that's being done in trauma right now, and how people are exposed to trauma, living with trauma, and they're trying to break trauma cycles within their families. So things go for generation and generation, and people start to kind of take it in and repeat those same patterns, those same things. And now we are, and this is where the light comes in. On an individual basis, there are people who are actively trying to wake up within themselves, bring some light this, and break those patterns, break those trauma cycles. And I think the same thing holds true for this country, for other countries, for humanity throughout history. We can look back and see these same cycles repeating over and over. And so how do we break those? How do we start to live with light in our lives? How do we bring love into the world versus all of these traumatic things? And you're right, part of it is identifying those things, identifying that shadow and looking at it with clear eyes. And then we can start to do things different, just like people do individually. They have to look at their past in order to heal it. And so that's what we need to do collectively.
Yeah. Well, in the song I wrote, one of the lines, again, I think I shared it already, is every generation has its own iteration when the dark comes in to play with the light. We're just in a different iteration of the same thing. And I think it's important for us to realize that. And the language of the shadow offers us a way of talking about it in those terms, that it is this same psychic pattern that is recurring. It also happens in the Hebrew scriptures over and over. It's the same pattern. Bob, what say you, bro?
Well, I was mentioning to you before we started today how I've been bouncing around in my own head for the last several days trying to figure out what I had to say on this topic. And it's very, very difficult, but it's really the struggle I've had for my whole life. And that's exemplified by the fact that I started out thinking I was a sociologist and I wanted to look at how society was operating. And then suddenly I found out, well, I really want to be a psychologist and figure out how I'm operating and how other people are operating. And again, it's that dichotomy between what individuals experience and what society, the stage that society sets for that experience to occur. And then I got into systems theory and found out that really what's going on at all the different levels of systems is analogous. So it's perfectly logical that you talk about the shadow of the country, because the country is a larger system than the individual. And it's perfectly okay to use those terms, and it sheds light onto it. But we can't ever forget that what's going on in the society at large is really an amalgam of all of the different people within it. And that's where Marianne is always talking about we need to find a way to let light into our lives individually and learn to act in ways that uplift all of us.
Yeah. And go ahead, Bob.
Go ahead. I was going to say, so that's what makes it so difficult, because it's easy for the powers that be in society to play on the fears of the individual. And that's what I think is going on in our country more than anything else today, is that those people in power, and I don't even know that they have planned it out this way, but they just have so much more power based on money, position, and means of influence, that they are able to pluck those strings of fear within each one of us. And it's really easy for us to fall back on safety and security needs, to use Maslow's terms.
Yeah.
The thing that people forget about mostly in Maslow's theory is that when you get up to a higher level, you never stay there. You're always falling back. And it's really easy to fall back. And we've talked about, cognitive dissonance. We've talked about all of these different things that occur.
Yeah.
So when individuals...
So we get lost in the shadow. We get lost in it.
Yeah. When people don't realize there is such a shadow, they just realize that their concept of who they should be and where they should fit into the world is being threatened.
Right. And it also runs contrary to the predominant American dharma, which is eat, drink, and be merry. That's what people live for. And it's really an interesting...
pursuit of happiness.
Exactly.
It's right there in the Declaration of Independence.
Well, and you both said something that's really important, and it's important for our time, and that's that we have a better language to talk about it. We can talk about it now at a number of different levels, and Bob, you've addressed some of those levels. And I think that that's part of getting that piece to human beings. I put something on Facebook about the shadow and all. One woman said, I don't have any idea what the heck any of that means. And it's like, well, I tried to, I gave her, referenced her to a site and all, but people need to be brought in on a way of thinking about these things. In the past, we've regressed them to politics or this or that. If we can create a language of healing, health, and wholeness, then we can start addressing these things, with some tools on our belt, if you will. I know when you go to a hospital 150 years ago and someone said, well, you got that thing that kills people, and what it is cancer. Now you go to a hospital, they can identify where the cancer is, what kind it is, and a whole flurry of treatments that will either help or give you some percentage, and a science to address that. How do we create a language? And Marianne, I loved your language of trauma, because I think for a lot of people, a way of life is being pulled out from under them. In the late 19th century and early 20th century, people were moving from farms to cities like gangbusters. Just an amazing event. Food changed, transportation changed, communication changed, all those changed because people were getting together and needed to cross-reference. And that was good, but it had an underbelly side. The underbelly side is our seeing each other as human beings and being face-to-face. And I think what we're going through today, whether we call it the Zoom revolution or whatever, is analogous to that. And it is traumatic. But America, and this is a piece that I've reiterated over and over, we are not a perfect union. We are reaching to continually participate in that process of becoming a better, closer to perfect union. What does that mean? We don't know. Right now, part of the shadow is there's a backlash against owning it, and people think we can be authoritarian, tell people what they can do and when they can do it, and that's going to make everything okay. It starts with abortion. It's going to end up, the gay thing's going to be next. I wonder if it's going to get down to mixed marriages. I don't think so, Supreme Court Thomas. Another piece.
Well,
go ahead, Marianne.
Well, I was just going to say,
I'm in a rant.
Well, when you were talking about these people that changing their ways of lives and coming together in urban centers, and that's where the diversity is. When you start to be with people who were not from that same tribe as you, or were not from that same way of life as you, and then how do you navigate working and living and loving people that are different from you? And I think that's a big part of
Amen.
That was America. At least that's what I was taught growing up, that America was founded on diversity. America was founded by bringing people of multiple faiths, multiple ethnicities, multiple places together and figuring out how to make life work with that diversity.
And yet, the same thing that happened in the late 19th, early 20th century was immigration. The Italians and the damn Irish. What's happening now? Immigration. There's a whole, the other. They're bad. And
Right.
That's part of our shadow stuff. It's a loss of power. White people are losing power. In the next 15 years, white people will no longer have the majority. That's why the Republican Party wants to, use their constitutional advantage to make sure that minority can rule. And believe me, that's what they're doing. And they don't give a flying fuck about how many kids get their heads blown off in schools. They don't give a damn how many 10-year-olds have to give birth and maybe die giving birth. They don't give a damn about you and me. They care about power. And that's an indictment. And I'm not a Democrat. Believe me, my friends, I am no Democrat. I am an independent. And, I definitely am a Angus King independent. Check him out. I think he's from Vermont. He also went to our high school, Bob. Did you know that?
I did not. That's amazing.
He graduated from Hammond. Go ahead, Bob. I'm in a rant, my friends, because I'm hurting so bad. I'm a hardcore patriot, and I happen to know the difference between a patriot and a cheerleader. Online there are so many goddamn cheerleaders. Go ahead, Bob. I'm sorry.
I was just going to say that at the root of the problem, and this sounds, cliche, but let me explain. At the root of the problem is the lack of truth. If you look at the individual who's confronting his or her own shadow, it's made more difficult because they lie to themselves. They use their persona, their ego, their defense mechanisms to keep from confronting the truth.
Comfort.
We're at the societal level, at the level of the country, we are not confronting the truth about ourselves, and that's where this whole idea of censoring history, of telling only the stories that make people feel good about themselves, and not telling the truthful stories. And until we are able to confront the truth about what's going on today, about what has gone on in the past, then we're not really confronting the shadow. We're avoiding that confrontation. And we can't come to peace with the shadow until we confront the shadow, until we realize the shadow is an equal part of our being and has all of these other parts within it that we need to integrate within our being. And what we do at the individual psychological level has to be done at the societal level. And as soon as people realize that they're being lied to, they need to take a stand against those lies. That's why the January 6th committee is so important.
Well,
the big lie that this country has been told about the election in 2020 is going to pollute everything that happens to this country from now on, unless we confront that lie today. And unless we confront every single person that perpetrates that lie.
Well, and I think it's important to include that it's not a rational argument. Again, it's you and I see it as rationally, but it's not. It's an identity issue. And when you talked about, cognitive dissonance and things like that, those are the powers that are in play and that hold people a prisoner to their narrative, if you will. And speaking of narrative, we're coming to the end of our time already, if you could believe it. It's amazing how ranting really makes time fly. Bob, so continue, but wrap it up as your final comment.
Okay. At the individual level, when we have a cell in our body that is poisoning us, we have to get rid of that cell. That's the whole basis of removing tumors and all of this kind of stuff. At the societal level, when we have groups and ideas that are poisoning our society, we have to figure ways to get rid of them. Now, at least to some degree, we're confronting white supremacy, which is one of those cancerous ideas. And the FBI is looking into it, and they identify it as the most dangerous thing about society, about our society today. Other things are the alienation of 18 to 21-year-old men who are so frustrated that they take a weapon to a parade. And we have to be able to confront those and cut them out of our society. And again, I'm hopeful that we can do that, but I don't think we will be able to move forward unless we are able to do that.
Amen. And Bob, what you're talking about are the consequences of an unowned shadow. Much of what we're going through is this denial. It literally is like whistling past the graveyard, is what it feels like to me. And my view is we should all go into a graveyard late at night and quit whistling and honor those things that are dead but are definitely part of our past. Mary Ann, your final comments?
Well, I think confronting the lies is the first step. And I think the January 6th Commission is doing that. It's confronting the lies. But we also have to be able to counter those lies with truth. And you said something, Bob, about the truth might be cliche. I don't think it's cliche at all. I think it's absolutely what we need. We need to be able to identify what is true and what isn't true. And we have lost that, especially in the public square. So I think that as much as we want things to be a certain way, unless we actually see them the way they are, nothing will ever change. And so we have to take away that our desire and replace it with the truth. And then what does that mean? And what do we do with that once we have confronted it? And that's where we have to start to counter those lies on an individual basis. I mean, we do that within our own psychology, but to step out and do that on a collective basis that's where we're heading. So,
Amen. And you know, truth is literally the first victim in the denial of the shadow. Because once you start denying those things that are easy to deny, it becomes easier to deny those things that are difficult to deny. You know, this journey has been a trip for me, literally and metaphorically. And I keep going back, what started this journey for me? And I'm going to ask my cohorts, what started it for you? You see, I have a root question that I asked when I was 5 years old, and it has plagued me ever since. All the other questions are related to it. They center on it. And my root question was simple. How does the world work? You know, I'm an inductive thinker, not a deductive one. Don't give me 1 and 1 equals 2 and then give me the multiplication, the divide. Give me infinity and induce down all of those pieces. See, that's how I've worked. I want to see the whole planet, which we can all do, but how does it work, man? And that's what this journey of the deep end has been about being, about life, about consciousness. How does it all work? So Bob and Marianne, think about it. What's the root question that really spun you on your journey, and how did that work out? My friends, God's peace, and in all things, may we own the dark and learn the light in brand new ways.